everybody. Welcome to this Blue Zone side event from Katowice to Glasgow, Just Transition Pathways in Central and Eastern Europe. This event is hosted by Climate Reality and Bankwatch CE Network. My name is Špela and I am a program manager at Climate Reality Europe, and I will be facilitating today's event for the next 75 minutes. A very welcome to our speakers and the audience joining us here in person in Glasgow, and welcome to all our virtual attendees who have joined us from around the world. In order to reach global zero emissions by 2050, the world will require transformational change and move away from fossil fuel-based industry. COP24, held in Katowice in 2018, failed to deliver on the most fundamental issue, such as raising climate ambition to contribute to much-needed transformational change. But COP24 was the moment when just transition came prominently in the climate policy discussion as it has never been before. Just Transition Declaration, signed by some 50 countries, emphasized the need for climate policies to ensure a just transition of the workforce that creates decent work and quality jobs. And today, we will look at what makes Central and Eastern Europe unique when it comes to the challenges and opportunities for just transition, and what lessons from the region experience can be useful for Western Balkans and other regions of the world. With that said, I would like to give a floor to our first speaker, Mr. Richard Fieldchak, head of the Institute and senior researcher at the Slovak Academy of Science. His work and research are focused on environmental and social policy development in the transitional countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. Fieldchak, who is joining us virtually, will talk about what makes the CEE region unique from the other European countries and the rest of the world when it comes to the economic and social cohesion policies vis-à-vis climate change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the floor and thank you for the invitation. Well, we could start here is trying to figure out what is actually a Central Eastern European region, and we would get into a vaguely defined mix of former Eastern Bloc countries, former Yugoslavia, with perhaps two distinctive features. These countries have some common ground of experiences with alternatives to capitalism, and in the same time, and historically, what Immanuel Wallerstein calls in his analysis, they are on the semi-periphery. They are on the periphery of the European Union, but in the same time, we may say that they are drafting or drifting towards the core, which is also usually the case with the climate policies. What is also a common line or commonalities for countries of Central Eastern Europe that we are here more or less 30 years after political changes. And if you look at what makes this region perhaps different from other European countries, although we see here very many similarities, especially with the countries of the South or other countries of the European Union. And we see here many similarities with other parts of the world. But let's say that we may identify here at least three different perspectives how we may look at this region. First of all, Central Eastern Europe becomes the region where the rule of market is almost absolute and complete. Secondly, you see here very strong perception of kind of alleged injustice and rights to develop. And thirdly, but not, last but not least, it's a kind of NIMS syndrome or Nonima Beggar syndrome, and searching for the least common denominator when it comes to putting on the table targets and ambitions. So let me maybe explore a little bit more these three perspectives. first of all, rule of market. Central Eastern Europe is a region where, according to Hungarian philosopher Gaspar Tamás, the rule of market is almost absolutely complete. What he meant, and what I trying to also use in my approach to analyzing this region, is that we have to understand that this is the region where we created, or perhaps better to say, we allowed to create systems with very limited solidarity. As we have seen on the migration crisis, you may see it also now live on the Polish-Belarus border. We see here crumbling welfare state. This is the region where we also pretty much see the syndrome of the race to the bottom, where countries are competing among each other for investors, trying to tailor policies for business, which very often suppress solidarity and inevitably shapes also public perception when it comes to the global story. In the same time, Central Eastern Europe is economically system which is under serious threat, and not only because it is the one region where, when the OECD is trying to analyze vulnerability of the countries when it comes to automatization, we have some 60 to 70% of jobs endangered. But the region is also kind of at the end of this breath. I mean, in terms of relative development, which is here done basically on the combination of low wages, relatively educated workforce, and which is now facing serious problems. It is a region where taxation is increasingly flat and unfair, where dividend and money are leaving legally the region to going outside and instead of precipitating somewhere into the society. The second perspective, you may look at the Central Eastern Europe. It's perhaps from the context of how countries here perceive climate change and climate change policy investments. It was interesting to see speeches of Polish and Czech Prime Minister, Slovak President here in Glasgow, where all, to some extent, illustrate commonalities in our attitudes to the global and European goals in climate change policies. I mean, Slovak President's speech was the most, I would say, optimistic or forward-looking. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, Poland, and Prime Minister Andrzej Babiš, the Czech Republic, were both making strong appeals that climate policy must put the welfare of citizens as the most important goal. They both, in a different way, outlined it, say, three principal issues strongly presented here. And the first is that the carbon neutrality is too expensive unless somebody, I know, EU or else compensate our steps. And at the same time, that it is too ambitious, too unrealistic for us, and somehow do not take into account local conditions. I would just quote from the speech of Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, where he said, in his words, Green Deal is not a deal, but an ideology in dystopic future. The impoverishment of families, rising unemployment, astronomical energy prices, the disintegration of industry, and in the end, destruction of the environment is seeks to protect. End of the quote. What is interesting in these attitudes, and which I'm trying to maybe illustrate it also on speeches our leading elites or politicians, is kind of feeling that the climate policies provide some sort of injustice to us. In a way, we have the right to develop, and there's a deeply rooted distrust of big ideas coming from the outside with some kind of hidden ideas or vested interest. What is also important, it correlates strongly with my first point of the rule of the market and the appeal of the people on the people, and it is remarkable that our politicians elites do not speak about cost for the rich, for the profit, for business. They are talking about cost for the common people. Also indicates that how we understand just transition is pretty much different, and it really differs from which perspective we're talking about just transition. To oppose climate policies and goals because we protect the common people and we hear about it from the very same people who are talking about minimizing welfare state, undermining working conditions, all sacrifice on the altar. Competitiveness is sometimes dangerous and posing very many questions. What actually the concept of just transition will mean in the future, and not only in this region. My third point would be about the NIM, or not about background syndrome, and searching for the least common denominator. I'm indeed afraid that the climate change investment regulations are going to be used in our countries as yet another excuse for cutting public spending instead of opening a serious debate about the future economic and social systems. See, Central Eastern Europe is so far not on the front of the countries who are suffering impacts from climate change. We are kind of sitting on a hill, looking at the valley where the water is rising, and the feeling is that we are more or less okay, and it's other people's business to make sacrifices. We did enough, and we have the right to develop. If I try to generalize the very attitudes we very often see in here in media and public discourse in many countries all around this place. So, in this context, position of Central Eastern countries to climate goals can be described as not really blocking, but more ignoring the bigger picture. So the outcome is then the simply somebody else's business, and somebody who should actually take action. And if you do something that perhaps we should not do more than it's like endangering our economies in short run, not thinking about bigger picture about global solidarity, about global implications from the climate change and climate change impact. So all in all, and in spite of bold words in speeches of politicians, the opposition among our political elite is more rhetorical than real, and we see increasing support for climate change policies among the people. We see a revival of the green movement, not only in big cities, but across the country, across the regions as well. The political opposition or political positions actually playing with the interests of common people and just transition are pretty much facing reality of the alternative perspective of the growth and how to actually see a future of the countries. On the other hand, I've been quite critical, I would say, so far, and it is easy to be critical. Central Eastern European countries are objectively often in more complicated position compared to core Western EU member states. They face adverse population trends. They have a brain drain or here a young generation, which is really massive. And we have economic centered around manufacturing, where if you take data about per capita manufacturing, then Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Poland are countries which actually have the highest share of GDP from manufacturing, and it's not kind of like an accident. Is the outcome of years of outsourcing and transition of some of the manufacturing industry using competitively lower wages and better conditions / more business prone and governmental attitudes here. And this provides our governments or our politics also with big question marks how to actually balance between interests of economy which is based on exploitation of cheap labor force and natural resources, in the same time how to decarbonize this economy and how to actually pay for the decarbonization of the economy in this situation where most of the profits from the business actually leaving the region without any serious taxation through system of dividends and some internal pricing systems within big corporations. So it's a puzzle and is a big challenge for the public policies here because of course we are here talking about new setup or new situation of counterbalancing interests which are very often contradictory to each other. So, being part of the European process, decarbonization, searching for alternative economic development paths may provide important inputs for the future of the region. In the same time, the progress is relatively slowly. Also, the countries here are lagging behind more advanced economies in terms of transition, in terms of actual investment into renewable energies, into decarbonization. And most of all, I would say also when we look at the opinion polls, we see here relatively weaker support of stronger policies for climate change, which, as I was trying to explain in my first point, we may also relate to the problem of, let's say, bigger social tensions, decommissioning of the welfare state, and social clashes, which are here, I would say, quite stronger than in many other countries, the European Union. So, to conclude, talking about just transition, it depends how we'll find a common ground of what transition actually is. So far, we talk about compensation for the people of energy poverty mostly. I would say that it's the same difference as to speak about charity versus real social policies. We need a vision of new environmental social state which would compensate environmental and social policies with strong welfare policies, and we should provide new vision for people, but we are far from it. On the other hand, as I said already, we see here growing green movement. We see here that the policies are in place. We may question how ambitious they are, or what are the goals, and how much it is really actually going to be implemented. But on the other hand, let's hope that this process is on the track, and that the decarbonization or climate neutrality 2050, which also the countries of Central Eastern European Union sign in for, will really materialize in a way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Fieldchak, for these interesting insights on realities of the CEE region. And please stay with us online for the question round at the end. And now we will turn to one of the cold regions in transition in Central and Eastern Europe, the host of COP24, Upper Silesia. Upper Silesia is one of the coal-reliant regions eligible for the so-called Just Transition Fund. Armed with 17.5 billion euros strong fund, European Commission has pledged to support coal-reliant regions to stop burning coal while preserving livelihoods and pensions of the impacted communities. Patryk Bialas, who is an urban activist, leader of the local movement BoMiasto, and one of the founders of the Silesian climate movement, will talk about the opportunities this European Commission Just Transition Fund brings to the region, and how the fossil fuel industry, coal in particular in this case, is putting in danger this opportunity in this Poland's main coal region.
Thank you very much for invitation, and I'm really sorry not to be in person with you during the event because of unexpected event. So thank you very much for invitation and being part of this very interesting discussion, I hope. First of all, I need to stress that Just Transition is one of the European Commission pillars coming from the European Green Deal strategic document, and Just Transition mechanism is one of these three pillars, which will be implemented, first of all, with a new Just Transition Fund dedicated over 17 billion of euros. The second part is Just Transition scheme in the InvestEU program. It is about 10 up to 15 billion of euros dedicated for Just Transition mechanism, and a new public sector loan facility over 1 billion for grants, euros for grants, and 10 billion of loans from European Investment Bank, which should mobilize over 18 billion of euros investments in Just Transition. European Commission expect that this money will be dedicated for people, for citizens, for companies, for sectors, of course, for member states and regions to implement or to start with objectives for low carbon economy, new jobs in green economy, sustainable transport, more innovation and more competitiveness in industry. I'm very happy on it. Regarding Upper Silesia, the region I'm from, the capital city Katowice, over 4 billion of euros will be dedicated for Poland and for 6 regions, we hope. In Poland, I mean Dolnośląskie, Śląskie, Małopolskie, Łódzkie, Lubelskie i Wielkopolska Wschodnia, of course. And Silesia region, I expect, will be one of the biggest beneficiaries of this Just Transition mechanism, which means about 2 billion of euros for grants. Why Silesia? Because Silesia is the biggest coal region in Europe, and of course, biggest challenge in Europe regarding Just Transition, and will affect 1 million of employees in 4.4 million of people living in Silesia. Just Transition is not new for Poland because due to facts and figures. In 1980, 193, in 2020, only 40 million tons of coal produced a year. Regarding employment, in the 90s, last century, in coal sector, we have in Poland over 400,000 people employed. Today, it is 80,000 people employed, so a huge reduction. 2 more figures regarding employment in energy sector in Silesia. We observe decreasing. In 2010, we had 23,000 people. 2018, only 16,000 of people employed in energy sector. And regarding the share of renewable energy technologies in energy mix for Silesia, the coal region in Europe, where over 96% of energy is produced from coal, we observe also increase in share of renewable energy, because 2009 there was 3.7%, 2019 over 4.4% of share renewables in energy sector. How the discussion changed in Poland and in Silesia since 2018 COP24 in Katowice. So first of all, instead of talking of restructuring industry, coal industry and energy industry in Poland, the national debate started talking on just transition. In 2018, the announcement of Polish representatives to COP was that in front of coal industry in Poland, we have 200 years. Today, we have 30 years future only. 2018, there was a discussion regarding clean coal technologies as support for in the process of climate crisis mitigation. Today we are talking about sector coupling and taxonomy. And finally, I don't agree with so-called social agreement statement on just transition, and I prefer to call it a coal deal between national government and miners' unions leaders. If there is enough time, I will explain it later, but finally in Poland we have the phase-out date on 2049, which I don't agree. In my opinion, it will be faster, much more faster. It will be fine if it will be 2030. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bialas, for highlighting the challenges of the coal-reliant regions that are facing with. And one of those challenges definitely remains inclusion of the civil society and other stakeholders whose voices need to be heard in the just transition development processes. Despite being a requirement, public consultation remains inadequate in CEE. And our next contributor, Ms. Katie Treadwell, Energy Policy Officer from WWF European Policy Office, will talk about public participation and social acceptance of the processes for transition in CEE.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Patryk covered a lot of what I was initially going to open with, which was what are we actually talking about here? Why are we talking about a just transition mechanism and what is it? So I think that just to kind of reiterate what's been said, the EU has boosted its ambition to from 40% emissions reduction in 2030 to 55% emissions reduction, and that's created a need for greater emphasis on the how we're going to deal with the social challenges, because whilst it will be beneficial overall, we are going to see some regions, as we were hearing, where there's going to be difficulties. And so the EU has promised a just transition, and so they launched a just transition mechanism, which you can see represented, and Patryk already went through it, so I won't go into that in any detail. But it is there to help people adapt. It's not there to deliver the transition itself. And so next slide, please. And I think the point that I'm coming to here is that each region has to develop a just transition plan in order to access that money. So 2 billion euros we heard from Patryk, potentially for Silesia, won't be there if they don't come up with a plan. And there are conditions that are in the just transition mechanism to say that these plans must be developed at the local level, and they must also be developed in partnership with all of those stakeholders who are affected. And this is really important because if you don't consult with the local people, you don't consult with the civil society, or you only make deals with one stakeholder, then you're not going to come up with a deal which actually reflects the needs and the vision and has the ownership of the people on the ground. So you can see that represented on the screen, I believe. I can't see fully the slides myself, but they should be developed until around mid-2022. And the Commission, the European Commission, has to approve them. So we're hoping that they're going to check that the partnership has been respected. Next slide, please. But what are we seeing in practice? So Bankwatch and WWF have both been following the plans, and WWF has an online scorecard tool, which you can see, I believe, on the right-hand side, and Bankwatch has been following the development of plans in 7 Central Eastern European countries, really looking at how they're performing and how they're developing. Next slide, please. So we are seeing some really good things. They are raising ambition in a lot of regions, and in some regions we're seeing really good practices where they are actually listening to the civil society, and they're focusing the attention at the local level. So this is what you need for a just transition. The impacts will be overall beneficial, but you're going to need to pay attention at the local level to the challenges, particular challenges, for instance, in mining regions. We are also seeing the European Commission is insisting that there's real transition. Some regions have already been told their funds will be withheld unless they actually plan a transition to 2030. They can't expect money for nothing. So yeah, overall it's looking pretty good. Maybe the next slide. Not all of it's that good. So what we can see is that there's still a lot of false promises, a lot of fossil fuel vision still included in those plans. So 8 of the 14, which the WWF tool has assessed, still include coal past 2030. If you look at the way that governments and banks are shunning coal, and we're seeing now as well, with all the announcements yesterday, you can't fail to have missed 25 organizations and governments saying they're not going to finance coal. Patryk said 3 years ago they were saying there's 200 years of coal left in the vision of the government. That's down to 30. That's still not true. And I think what's concerning here is these governments are not always listening to what's actually happening on the ground, and they're not listening to the people, they're not engaging with them properly, and they're sleepwalking them to a cliff edge transition, or at least a very rocky slope. And so, yeah, they've also got gas in there, which we're seeing a lot of price volatility in the gas. Again, this is not telling people the truth, and I think that's one of the problems, is there's a lack of honesty in the engagement. And then, yeah, sometimes the partnership provisions have been good. We've seen some really good practices in some regions, and I think actually it's the Silesia plan where they want to engage the communities going forward for many years on the just transition. And so there are positive stories, but we are seeing that it's a mixed picture, and in some cases consultations have run for 3 days over the weekend, for example. So we do see there's a lot of room for improvement in the plans. So I think just to kind of to conclude, yesterday we had an event as well where we had mayors speaking from the coal regions, and there was one, Michal Bieda from Bytom, and he mentioned there is a town, in his town coal has been on the way out for a long time, and yet the government is still saying there will be coal, and actually you need to start planning as early as possible to actually ensure a just transition for people. And so I think I will leave it there, but I think as a final point, Poland's backtracking yesterday on its commitment for 2030 coal phase-out, 2030 coal phase-out is actually going to betray communities rather than ensure a just transition. And we have to ask, who are they actually protecting? Are they protecting the people or the unions and utilities who see renewables as a threat to their market position? Thank you.
Not yet. yeah, we will definitely keep an eye on those promises and hope that those are not just one of those words that remain somewhere on a paper, and yeah, and the reality remains world apart. But now let's look beyond the borders of Central and Eastern Europe and look at its neighboring countries of Western Balkans. In November 2020, the leaders of the 7 countries in the Balkan Peninsula committed to decarbonize their economies, and similarly as the EU committed to reach climate neutrality by 2050. But the Western Balkan countries face different realities as their EU member state neighbors. Victoria Shevchuk, who is conducting advocacy work on just transition in Western Balkans and working as a coordinator for just transition in CEE Bankwatch network, will highlight the similarity and differences of just transition between Western Balkans countries and CEE in a video message.
Hello everyone, thank you for the possibility to participate in this side event, even virtually. Unfortunately, you will hear only my voice. So, my name is Victoria Shevchuk and I work as Just Transition Coordinator for the Western Balkans in Bankwatch Network. Today, I will speak about the similarities and differences of coal phase-out for the Western Balkans and Central and Eastern European countries. First similarity that I would like to highlight, it's failed transformation in 90s and public mistrust to the government. Central and Eastern European countries has already passed through the failed transition lessons which led to industrial fall and unplanned mine closure in 90s. And for the Western Balkan countries, it was Yugoslavia war, an industrial and an economic collapse which has led to distrust of communities in the authorities. The concept is not widespread and no involvement of the local communities in just transition process, and information is not actively promoted on the national level. The interest in subject is growing indeed. Of course, there are cases where the community involved in such as Eastern Wielkopolska from Poland, Upper Nitra from Slovakia, municipalities Banovici and community Fajtovici from Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it's more exception than a common rule. Countries started to set coal phase-out dates, and we see a big difference between 2016 and 2021. But still, we are missing the details how this will be achieved, at least for the Western Balkan countries. Paris Agreement and the EU flagship European Green Deal policy strive to tackle these issues together and provided common legal umbrella for all countries and making sure that no one left behind in this major transition. And now we reach the differences. The European Green Deal and Green Agenda is a similarity and difference in the same time. The Green Deal, it's a roadmap for making EU economy sustainable and covers all sectors of economy, aims to boost the efficient use of resources, has concrete action plan and funding mechanisms, has precisely defined timeline. Green Agenda for the Western Balkans aims to assist the region in tackling pollution problems and aligning the country's environmental quality regulation with the European acquis. But still there are some uncertainties in action plan roadmap and funding sources unable to implement the action plan, and no clear timeline. 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets implementation. For Central and Eastern European countries, targets under the current legislation, EU member states have binding greenhouse gas emission targets for 2021-2030. It's a part of the European Green Deal. The European Commission adopted a series of legislative proposals that requires action from all sectors to achieve the targets. And for Western Balkan countries, targets under the 2020 General Policy Guidelines, and the guidelines represent the political consensus. There are no 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets adopted on the energy community level. Emissions legislation is not delivering the results because countries are non-compliant and there are no sanctions for non-compliance, unfortunately. And another big difference, strong dependence on coal and lignite in energy system of the Western Balkans. The Western Balkan countries historically are rich in coal and lignite and now must address the challenges of just transition. But despite a huge potential for developing green energy in the Western Balkan countries, the countries heavily rely on coal in electricity production. For instance, for Serbia it's almost 70% and for Kosovo it's almost 90%. And it's also the reason why it's so complicated to negotiate about the coal phase-out date with the countries. Lack of transparency and complicated political situation inside and outside the countries, which is slow in taking the required decisions. State capture, geopolitics, and lack of rule of law and accountability. This broad set of issues encompasses just transition decision-making. Yes, despite all reasons, excellent interconnection of the countries and existing technologies that could improve the efficiency and overall use of resources, the Western Balkan country is still lagging. And the last, but extremely important difference, no just transition funding mechanism available for the Western Balkan countries. Mainly, it is loans or projects or programs funded from different institutions and resources. The establishment of the Just Transition Fund for the Western Balkans is crucial for implementing the reforms required to move forward on the EU path. And the last, I would like to highlight the just priorities for the Western Balkans agenda. First, it's the establishment of dedicated Just Transition Fund for the Western Balkans. Second, no new coal power plants projects in the region. Third, healthy environment. Fourth, compliance of LCPD. Fifth, sustainable and efficient economy. And the last, decent jobs and quality life. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, as evident also from the case of the Western Balkan countries, transition is happening at different speed and scope in different parts of the world. There is no one-size-fits-all, as transitions must take into account specific social and economic conditions. Dr. Stępień, social and climate activist and a Just Transition campaign coordinator for Central and Eastern Europe at CEE Bankwatch Network, will draw parallels between CEE and other regions of the world with a focus on African continent as a PhD graduate in African Studies.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So, as you've heard, I'm going to be talking mostly about Africa, and I think this is very on point because as just 2 days ago, $8.5 billion was designated for a transition fund for South Africa. Which I think is one of the more important decisions made during COP so far. So this fund was, this is called the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And most of the money will be coming from France, Germany, UK, the USA, and the European Union. And this is, I want to start with this because this highlights one of the most important messages I want to bring across, that we are at a moment in time when we know that the transition has to be global. We have various regions which are currently already on track towards the transition, and they are on this pathway, while simultaneously it will be a learning process. So this is why I want to sort of draw sort of parallels between what is going on in Central and Eastern Europe, where I live, and between the situation, for example, in South Africa, about which I actually wrote my PhD thesis, and I was born in Zambia, so this is also very relevant to where I've been in my life. So if you look at the Central and Eastern European context, and also from what Richard Fieldchak was mentioning, you have this perception of the right to develop. And this is a perception that is shared not only by Central and Eastern European countries, by the Western Balkans, but also by many of the countries of the global South, or yeah, I would say that's enough. So chasing the West and chasing the global North is seen as something that is their right. At the same time, you have countries which have a huge dependency on coal or other fossil fuels. Here we saw the example of the Western Balkans. In South Africa, the dependency on coal is above 75%. This means that very frequently in such countries, the climate policies are seen as unjust. Climate policies are politically difficult to introduce, and it requires a lot of very specific sort of movements and policies in place in order to make sure that this is done correctly. On the example of the Central and Eastern European case, you have to see that the first thing, of course, is that you have the funds in place. So this has been mentioned a number of times today. If the funds are in place, there is more of a possibility of convincing people on the ground to at least be more open towards the whole possibility. The second thing is a very clear timeline. And a participatory process in which primarily those people who will be directly affected are involved and included in the process. Another sort of similarity between Central and Eastern Europe and I would say generally countries of the global South, especially Africa, is a history of high mistrust towards countries of the global North or countries of the West from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. This is caused by, well, in the case of the global South, of course, by colonialism and neo-colonialism. In the case of Central and Eastern Europe, by what happened following the transformation, when the Iron Curtain fell in the 1990s. So the transformation very frequently meant that the changes that were introduced there were very difficult for the people on the ground. There has been an increased polarization of the societies and increasing poverty, especially energy poverty. One of the very big similarities is the outsourcing of problems. So one of the, I think, more difficult experiences that were during the 1990s in Central and Eastern Europe was the outsourcing of problems like waste production, which is also very similar to what is happening in Africa, where you have European countries sending their waste into various places in Africa. And also, we had the same situation, we still have the same situation in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe. You also have the outsourcing of various manufacturing jobs, and frequently at these various companies within the global South or in Central and Eastern Europe, the work conditions are frequently much lower than they would be in Western Europe. So when you hear of mistrust from countries that are outside of, let's say, the highest or the biggest economies, for such processes, what they're actually worried about is that these processes will not be conducted in a way that is actually just. So I think one of the most important things that we should be talking about here and at all such events is how do we make sure that this is not just a way for somebody to get financial benefits or economic benefits at the cost of countries that will be going through the transition process. We all know that it is absolutely necessary for all of these countries to be involved in the process, but without donations and financial measures like the one set up for Central and Eastern Europe and the one that has been recently set up for South Africa, this will not be possible. So without a global transition, the climate crisis will in no way be averted or even slowed down. The process in Central and Eastern Europe can serve, if well done, as a roadmap of how to face the challenge globally. Thank you.
Thank you. The ongoing COP is our best and possibly our last chance for the world to commit to urgent climate action that also tackles equity and social justice. And before I give a chance as well to the audience for the questions, I would like to ask everybody, our speakers, to tell us their view on what needs to be achieved here in Glasgow to make the just transition in CEE and other regions of the world a reality. And with that said, I would like to invite Mr. Fieldchak for his comment, if he is still online with us. Richard?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm online, but I was just waiting for the microphone. This takes a few seconds. Okay.
Yeah? Do you want me to repeat the question?
I think, yes.
So, what in your view needs to be achieved here in Glasgow to make the just transition in CEE, and yeah, in your case, in CEE, of a reality?
Well, I don't expect that there will be some breakthrough in Glasgow in the approach to the concept of just transition, which is pretty much, at least in Central Eastern Europe, dominated by the perception and policies of the European Union. But I generally believe that this is the first step towards more complicated and more, I would say, challenging debate how to understand just transition not as a separate project, but to understand just transition as a concept, how to change our economies, how to change our tax system towards more just and fair system, and how to transform concepts of how we understand growth in our understanding. So what I would say is it's an important step and I see just transition fund, just transition mechanism as important steps towards ultimate goals of transition. But we definitely need to stop thinking about just transition as a separate, isolated project. We have to understand that just transition is a concept which needs to be integral part of all social, economic, industrial policies.
Thank you. And I suggest we stay with our virtual speakers. So, Patryk, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. Go ahead.
So, in my opinion, here in Glasgow, after Katowice climate conference, we should focus not only on cooperation, partnership, and international multilateral cooperation. In my opinion, in Glasgow, it should be announced that just transition should be connected with transition targets and emission reduction objectives. Just transition is very strong connected with climate neutrality and phasing out coal, and it must be stressed right now and it must be accepted. This strategy, how to make the Central and Eastern Europe climate neutral in 2015 and coal-free part of Europe in 2030 is my great expectation. It should be stressed too that just transition is about people, is about their threats, is about their expectations, and based on interviewing local people who are affected by coal industry and other coal-based sectors, should be built the green future of Central and Eastern Europe. In my opinion, just transition is also a part of green and digital transition, and we need to be aware on it, and I hope this kind of statements will be part of Glasgow Agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patryk. Katie.
Thank you. Yes, you can hear me. Yeah, so I think I'd agree with a lot of that. I think, as I said earlier, and we've heard a lot, you need to have plans in place. You need to start actually getting the ball moving. And so I think what Glasgow needs to achieve is not sort of high-level announcements that aren't necessarily meaningful. We need to have actual honesty about really where this is going. So saying, you know, don't worry, we are going to phase out coal, but it's going to be in the 2040s, or it's going to be 2049, or it's going to be 2038 in some countries. It's not being honest, and it's not setting the right direction. So I think that we need, whilst the phase-out date starts the ball moving, if you tell people they have longer than they do, they're going to sleepwalk to that cliff edge. So I think for a just transition, we need to start really getting the ball moving and people being honest about the dates for that. And then I think as well, we've heard about the partnerships. The partnership is important, so getting people involved, but we need the right frameworks in place for that. So I think things like the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was launched, yes, it should finance projects, but it should also be providing technical assistance, and it should be providing those kind of frameworks to actually enable the just transition to take place, because just transition is not projects, it's a process. It's delivered through projects over time. And obviously there needs to be ownership on the ground, so that needs to empower the local level, and the right partnerships need to be there as well. And then finally, yes, solidarity is important. So again, these announcements are nice, but they need to be accompanied with actions, including those financial commitments, but like I said, embedded in frameworks. And just to give a bit of a push, we have a Just Energy Transformation paper which we released yesterday, which goes into a bit more detail about the kind of frameworks which we're thinking about in WWF to ensure that just transitions deliver that overall real justice across everywhere. Thank you.
And Milka, what would be your add-on?
I think with just transition, what needs to sort of come across is how important it is, but also that it not be presented only as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. As an opportunity for providing countries with an economic and technological leap, which will also be linked to improving health matters, especially in the area of, for example, air pollution, smog, because this is an issue both in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Western Balkans, in South Africa, outside Johannesburg, where the air is so bad that kids are dying because of asthma. So this just transition here at COP has to be also, the phase out of coal has to be shown, and I think this is quite rare here, has to be shown as something that will provide a better future for our children and for our grandchildren. I think that some of the greatest people that are coming here to COP are, for example, the parents for climate, or grandmothers for climate, or babies for climate. So these are the people who are actually talking about what they are experiencing on the ground. And these are the people that we should be listening to, because a lot of what we're getting at the high-level meetings is not the real story. The real story is what we're getting from real people down there on the ground. Thank you.
Yeah, and now it's time for your question. I would like to point to the 4 microphones we have at the side. So those of you who would like to ask questions, please feel free to go to the microphone. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Mahib Sandhu and I work for the Climate Reality Project Canada branch, where we are actually also undergoing a just transition, or attempting to. Recognizing that today is a day at COP that's focused on youth, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the strategy for engaging future generations and young people today in just transitions planning, especially as countries are looking at phase-outs and transitions to 2030, 2040. How are you engaging with young people and showing them what their future economy, labor prospects, health could look like in these different scenarios?
Do you want to address this question? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to mention a very concrete example. This is from Eastern Wielkopolska in Poland, where I'm based. This is actually one of the examples given in the just transition process from Central and Eastern Europe as one of the best processes, because it's very strongly based on the partnership principle. So it's open to any stakeholder, it's very transparent, and it has provided a lot of space for people to participate in the creation of the plans for the just transition of the region. And one of the things that were done within the scope of this was special youth workshops, because typically in mining regions, this is a lignite mining region, so it has a very specific sort of it has a specific, I would say, specific generational issues, mostly linked to the fact that we're having sort of an outflow of younger people, of the younger generation from such regions. So there was a lot of focus on involving the youth in sort of creating a vision for the region past coal. And part of their ideas and concepts were included into the plan. So I know that there are many regions in which, just transition regions in which this is done. Unfortunately, there are also those that don't really take into account the specificity of such matters, because it is a very, very concrete matter that a lot of these young people do not see a future for themselves in such coal regions. They don't see future of employment and other such linked matters. But also we have, in a lot of these regions, we have youth climate organizations, and they are very actively involved also in the just transition process.
Yes, please, Katie.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we need to ask, when we talk about just transition, who are we talking about it being just for? Because I think one of the things which we see when some groups, some governments talk about just transition, they focus only on the transition from fossil fuels for the fossil fuel workers, who are a very important constituency, and that needs to be considered, need to be involved, very involved. But when we talk about just transition, we need to look at the whole picture, and it's why we're saying that for just transitions to be really just, they need to be 1.5 aligned, as in they need to ensure that we're keeping temperatures rise below 1.5 degrees, otherwise the future generations are not going to have a proper future. They're going to also not have the same opportunities that we've had, and we also need to be consulting everybody. So social dialogue with the unions is incredibly important, and I think the most progressive ones recognize the need as well to protect the rights of future generations and future workers. But you need to be really consulting everybody and meaningfully having those processes open and transparent and actually engaging everyone.
I would just like to check whether Richard or Patryk would like to add anything on that. If not, we would like to move to the next question. We have waiting already. Just a second to see whether they would like to raise their virtual hand. No. So let's move to the next question, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mariana Winiarska. I am from Ukraine. I represent Ukrainian Climate Network, and I have the following questions. Whether there is some clearance about the plans that need to be developed for the access to the funds for phasing out coal. As you know, Ukraine also developed such goals. And what can be included as losses that need to be covered, and that for which country can ask for financing from the existing funds? Thank you.
Should you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, if I understood correctly, the plans are how the countries who don't have a clear guidance on just transition plans, such as European Union's country, where they can turn to and what needs to be included in their coast phase out call, where they can search as an example and finance. Is this?
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you want to answer? I can give a go. So I think this is a challenge. I think that this is where, until you have that vision that you are actually going to phase out coal, or you're going to phase out of a fossil fuel, people aren't going to start making those plans. And until you have those plans, there's going to be nothing for investors to finance. So there are some pioneering local level initiatives. So we work with quite progressive mayors in Europe in WWF, and I presume also elsewhere. I know there's some in the Western Balkans and Ukraine as well. And these mayors are ready to start the kind of process, but obviously they need that public support from the national level. However, having that clarity and starting that process of talking about the fact that coal is disappearing, or that we aren't going to be able to use it anymore because it's not economical, but also we need to address climate change. We know, I think it's called the inevitable policy response. We know that we're going to see these phase-outs happening, so we need to start planning now, and that can then provide certainty to private investors, and hopefully unlock some public money as well. But absolutely, that's something that needs to be pushed for, is public money for that kind of, for these processes to start.
Thank you, Katie. And I think Patryk is raising his hand to add his comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I tried to raise my hand during the previous question, and but it was a little bit complicated. So maybe answering the previous question about youth engagement in my region, in Silesia, I can tell two stories, two examples. The first one is how we in civil society organizations in the process of public consultations engage youth. The second one is how the regional government, which is responsible for a just transition territorial plan for Silesia, engaged youth. And you can select which way you prefer. The first one is that during pandemic and lockdown, we organized with support of Climate Reality a series of webinars, online workshops for civil society activists to define demands for just transition in Silesia. And we invited also the representatives of young generation, the youth climate movement in Poland, and people, participants were really, really engaged. And the good news was that because it was defined in really partnership, just immediately youth climate movement started to be an advocate for just transition in my region. The second example was that after drafting, I think, second and third draft of Just Transition Territorial Plan, regional government sent this proposal to regional parliament of youth to discuss it in parliament hall. It was a very high level discussion, and only one news on the regional government website was present on it. So in my opinion, we should engage people in bottom-up approach instead of top-down approach, which was presented. It was okay, but at the end of the day, we had much more stronger voice of the grassroots people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Patryk. And I think we should come back to the previous questions. And Miłka, you have some comment on where the other countries can get inspiration.
Okay, so I wanted to, because if I got it correctly, you're from the Ukraine, yes? Currently there is a whole process of, let's say, dialogue on the just transition between the EU and Ukraine and the Western Balkans. So that's one of the processes that should definitely be on your radar. In addition, I would like to say from my own experience, because when I began working on just transition, it was actually in my free time as an activist in, I think, 2017. Nobody had heard about just transition in my region. We were looking for opportunities of how to help the region with the declining mining industry, and it's a mono economy, so it's very dependent on coal and on the coal-fired energy plants there. And we became interested as local activists in the just transition process before it even became popular. We started going to Brussels to learn about the whole process. And thanks to our own involvement, we actually got the local authorities also involved in the whole process. And now we can say that we're one of the pioneering regions in Poland to do just transition. So I think the most important thing is to look at other regions who have had similar experiences, to learn from the just transition plans that they are currently putting in place and how they did it, and try and implement the same thing in your regions. I think there are going to be increasing opportunities for also finding financial support for such processes, because that's what's happening here at COP, and that's what's been happening over the past years. So I think this will be in next year and over the next years, we will be seeing more and more countries joining this process, and we need to learn from each other, from our mistakes and from what we've managed to do well so far. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add, be brave and ambitious. And I think we have chance for one very quick question, if there is one. Yes.
Hi, my name is Santeri. Thank you for the talk, very interesting. And thank you for bringing the global perspective as well through some of the African nations that you mentioned. And that made me think of the global perspective. As I understand, the Just Transition Fund is only a European mechanism for European communities. How can we ensure that the global supply chains, when just transition, that it happens there as well? I guess that's my very badly formulated question. But there's European demand, and that this will cascade through the supply chains. How do we ensure that we don't leave the international community in the room? Thanks.
So, Mika, I would leave this to you.
Okay. It's already cascading. So as we can see with this initiative for South Africa, with the Just Transition Partnership, there are similar ideas, like I said, for the Ukraine, for the Western Balkans, and we can also see similar such initiatives beginning in parts of Asia. So this is already cascading. I think one of the big issues pre-COP was that the big economies have not fulfilled their obligation to donate, to finance, to provide financial assistance for countries going through such processes up until now. So this was something that pre-COP was commented on in the media. And I think this is a big issue that has to be amended in the nearest future.
Thank you. That was right on time.
Thank you very much.
We just received a red light here that our time is up. Let me just very, very welcome everybody for joining and sharing your expertise and experiences. And thank you for your attention. And as well, very, very thank you for the excellent technical support for today's event.